All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kevin Boone, and this is my podcast called Standing in Both Worlds. And here we focus on conversations about the worlds of mental health, human well-being, and human potential, and how they relate to our world of technology and how we build wealth and economy within our society. So today I'm really delighted that I have a guest on the show today, Victoria Volk. And Victoria is an expert on the topic of grief. And Victoria is a writer. She's an author, an advanced grief recovery specialist, which we'll dive into in this conversation. She is a YouMap certified coach, a podcaster, and she is a trained end-of-life doula. So lots of awesome credentials behind that name. So I'm interested in getting into that, Victoria. Victoria uses a proven method called the grief recovery method that provides tools for anyone to complete with unresolved grief. And I've worked with Victoria myself as I've gone through a bit of my own grief journey. And so I can attest to her abilities both as a trusted facilitator and the method that she uses through this. So really excited. I will share the website as we start here. Her website is called www.theunleashedheart.com, and she has a podcast of the same name. So, or I think you do. Well,
Grieving Voices.
That's it. You know what? Thank you. Thank you for that. Grieving Voices is the podcast. So what I'm going to invite you to do today is that if you are currently experiencing grief in your life, or if you know somebody who's struggling in some of these areas, then take some time to just listen to our conversation today, because I think you'll get some good value out of it. So welcome, Victoria. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
For joining me today. And so I guess the first question I wanted to ask is, who is Victoria? Who are you? What has brought you into this world where kind of this specialty that you've created is this, understanding around grief? So maybe we could start with that, just to learn a little bit about you, what you're all about.
Well, what first came to my mind was I am a deep feeling, deep thinking, highly sensitive person who thought for most of my life that something was wrong with me.
Got it.
And it became a personal quest of mine. Kind of had a midlife crisis in my mid-30s. And it became a quest of mine to figure out why I felt so messed up internally. And because I'm deep thinking and deep feeling, which we can expand on the YouMap later, but which affirmed so much for me, but also understanding what it is to be highly sensitive. I never understood that either until I dove into energy work. But yeah, it really just set me on this path to where I am today, because I've realized that there's nothing wrong with me. And anyone listening to this, there is absolutely nothing wrong with you either. There is nothing you need to fix or change about who you are at your core and in your soul. It's really a matter of connecting to that person that's in there, that was always there, but because of belief systems passed down to us, or self-imposing beliefs that we, self-perpetuate, our thought system, our belief system about ourselves, what we believe about money, what we believe about religion or faith, what we believe about grief, for instance, more importantly, that is what carries us through our life. That's the foundation. Our beliefs really are a foundation of how we perceive the world and perceive ourselves. And once we challenge those beliefs, we really find our own truth. And that's really what the past well, since 2014 that I've been on the path of discovering my own truth. And what that is for me is that there is nothing wrong with me. There never has been. I just was looking for outside validation and outside affirmation and everything outside of myself to complete something within me that I never received as a child, that
Mhm.
many of us don't receive as children because our parents just don't know better. And they come into their parenting role with their beliefs and their perspectives and their traumas and their stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so this is why the beliefs are passed down. This is how traditions of limiting beliefs get shared and go on for generations.
Yeah.
And it's just coming home to yourself so you can break this cycle. You can become the best version of yourself. And that's really what my life has been the last 3 years hardcore. So
Very cool. And it's, and when you say that, it's really interesting because what you just said, there's nothing wrong with me. And I realized that in my own journey too. It's, there was the longest time where I really just felt, oh my God, I'm doing all this stuff wrong. And oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm not as productive as I want to be in my life, or I'm not showing up in all these areas. And I guess that relates to what I would call, like, how our society views grief, right? Like it's, there tends to be a suppression, right? Of anything that shows weakness, right? And I'm just curious, like, I don't know if there's anything you can add with that, but but why is that? Why do we suppress grief? And or how common is it? Maybe that's the bigger question, you know?
yeah, and not everyone suppresses it. Some people fully express it. They like vomit their grief, but it doesn't come out as grief. It comes out as anger and it comes out as hate and it comes out as a projection of something else masking the grief. So we either implode or we explode. And I do think there probably is a period of time, not even gender specific, both men and women may hold in, bite your tongue, don't speak authentically from, your throat chakra. You don't express what you're feeling, or if you do express what you're feeling, you're not heard. So this is where we get all of these different complexes within relationships. And this is why grief is so complex, because we are in relationship with people. And that's often where our grief comes from, is relationships. And so it can be very easy to just disengage from life, to disconnect from others. And in the process, we also disconnect from ourselves. We are truly the ones suffering. And so it is common, yes, that because these, again, it comes down to the beliefs being passed down. If as a family, and we are products of our environment too. So if in the family unit, I just actually had a conversation about this yesterday, where the person grew up in a very positive, optimistic home.
Yes.
Grief didn't hit his life until he was in his 20s.
Yeah.
And he just could not even comprehend that death was even possible.
Yeah.
Like that was even going to happen, that was even going to be a part of the equation. And in fact, up until the end of his father's life, until he truly did die, they still had this positive mindset about what he's going to recover from this, right? It's like almost like this denial. And in that denial, we suffer too, because there could be conversations you could be having that are rich and meaningful and deep, but you didn't have them because you had this idea or this belief passed down that nothing bad would happen. And if it did, we'd get through it.
Yeah.
We'd be on the other side of it and everything will be great. And then you can grow up in a home where everything is negative and pessimistic and woe is me and you're the victim.
Yeah.
So the pendulum can swing both ways. It's very fascinating to me. I find it fascinating
Yeah,
because either way, it has an impact on how you approach grief.
yeah, fascinating. So there's two things that I'm hearing there, right? It's the one aspect is the fact, and I know I was like this, for much of my early life, I had never dealt with grief. Like it was, like I kind of grew through this world in some ways in kind of a weird kind of way. Even though my mother had anxiety and depression issues, it was just kind of my world. So I actually didn't know that maybe there was some grief there that I needed to look at. But on the other hand, you have this idea that, oh, okay, the world, you're invincible. It's like I can go out and just do all this stuff. And then something hits you. And I'm curious, and maybe just for the listener to kind of maybe just to uncover, what are types of grief that people deal with? Like what's some examples? Like, because I know there's death and there's lost relationships, but like what do you find are kind of areas that, where grief hits unexpectedly, if you will?
Yeah. Well, there's more than 40 plus different losses.
Okay.
And I mean, we'll take some of the common ones. Obviously, death of a friend, family, someone close to you. Could be even your neighbor. So death of someone close to you.
Yeah.
Divorce, loss of a pet, miscarriage, which is actually miscarriage and pet loss are two of the most minimized losses
Yeah.
because you can just go down to the pet store and get a new pet and you can just have another baby, right? These are things people say unintentionally, but they're very hurtful. You can lose your job, career, you can lose sense of, there's intangible losses like loss of safety, loss of security, financial loss, natural disaster can take away your home, can have ripple effects, right? You might have to move, you might have to switch careers, you might have to move away from your family. You might divorce because you can't take your marriage can't handle the stress and the pressure of all that change, like just
Yeah.
compacted in a short period of time. So there's ripples to grief too. It's not just about one loss. If you're getting divorced and there's children involved, there's grief that ripples through the family. Then if you have friends within that marriage and you divorce, that's more grief, right? That's grief
Yeah.
for that's grief for the friends because now the friends, let's say they used to spend so much time together. Well, now that dynamic has changed.
Yes.
And then you feel like you have to choose sides, right? If it's not an amicable divorce.
Yeah.
So we can look at it so many ways, and there's so many layers to one event that can just have these ripple effects.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many.
Fascinating. I
Adoption, being adopted, conflict in that. There's being an orphan. Let's say you're not even adopted, you're in an orphanage. Can't have a baby, losing physical illness,
Yeah.
chronic illness.
So
Yeah,
there's a
so
lot.
many. There's a lot. And I guarantee every single listener here has experienced grief. They just have suppressed it,
Yeah.
or it just has not made its impact in a noticeable, in your face way. But I guarantee you it is. It's
Yeah.
affecting your ability to make income. It's impacting your relationships. It's impacting your parenting.
Hmm.
It's showing up somehow. It's maybe even physically manifesting if you have migraines, fibromyalgia, autoimmune,
Yeah.
so many things.
Yeah. There's a denial of it, right? In many ways, like generally in our society, we tend to kind of push it down. And I know that was my experience for many years. And I think that when I first discovered you and connected with you, I saw you being interviewed on a YouTube video like this. And it was about the topic of grief. And one of the things that you said that really got me to actually reach out to you was this idea that grief was cumulative. And what I realized at the time is that I had worked in very busy jobs all my career, like they were super stressful, lots of pressure, lots of responsibility, not always a lot of time to think. I had, parents, family kind of things where they went through health challenges. And then I had like, being able to show up with a relationship with, there was a lot of dynamics there, just challenges that you face. And going into that cycle where I realized that for many years, I was in a cycle where my way to turn off from my life and to give time for me for introspection was usually I would come home, I'd be incredibly stressed out. And what would I do? I'd sit in front of the TV, I'd eat food, or I'd drink, right? Like alcohol, right? Like have a few drinks. And I realized that for many years of doing that, there was something, especially as I get older, that just caught up. So this idea that grief was cumulative, I realized that I was carrying years and years of unresolved heartache, if you will. That's maybe the best way to kind of say it. So I just love to get your feedback on what's the cumulative nature of grief and why is that so important?
Because people don't realize that events that have happened in the past, even as a child, let's say which often for children, it's either having to move, you lose your
Yeah.
friends, or you lose a pet. There's an opportunity, a missed opportunity that parents have there to have the first conversation about grief and about loss that often isn't had. And it's allowing the child to fully express what they are feeling in the moment, even if it's anger, because in a lot of homes, anger is unacceptable. It's an
Absolutely.
unacceptable and shamed emotion, which
Yeah.
it's an emotion, just like all emotions.
Yeah.
And so you're not taught how to emotionally stabilize yourself.
Yes.
And so when it comes out, it can come out and look really ugly, and that's displeasing.
Yeah.
So let's just stuff down that anger,
Yeah.
which is what I did and what I was taught to do. Because really my tears were just anger. I was,
Yes.
I would speak, but I wouldn't be heard.
Yeah.
And it was, being shushed a lot.
Yeah.
I don't want to be heard, be seen, but don't be heard type of thing. And so that's what happens in childhood, things like that.
Yeah.
And those stick with you
Yeah.
like Velcro.
Yeah.
They're there, they're always there. And what happens is you keep growing up and you keep having different experiences. You might be bullied, you might have problems with food, even as a child. Food might even be used as a reward,
Yeah.
or it might be a punishment. So,
We're soothing, right? That's how my
yep,
family used food. It was junk food was a soothing, that's what it was. It would just suppress whatever it was, oh, I'll have some chips or I'll have whatever it is, a snack.
right. Yeah, exactly. So, like, I come home from school, let's say you're bullied or something. Well, just forget about those kids. They're mean, whatever. Let's just go get some ice cream. That'll help you feel better.
Doula.
Instead of really having a conversation about what's really happening, how is it really making you feel? And is there something we can do about that? Right? Like it's really addressing what's happening and the emotion involved in that. And so as parents, we miss those opportunities right out of the gate. And kids, when we're born into this world, we naturally know how to grieve.
Yeah.
We cry and communicate what we need and
Yeah.
what is hurting us if something is hurting, right?
Yeah.
But we are taught to like shut that down, to put that away and sweep it under the rug as we get older.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating, right? We do tend to have a lack of understanding about being able to let people express and almost be seen, right? Like it's, hear me, what's going on for you? You know what? I'm
Yeah.
really sad or I'm really angry, right? We don't have a way to really bring those conversations forward, especially with kids. you know?
Yeah. And so when you're as a child, imagine yourself with a backpack, and
Yeah,
every one of those events is a rock,
yeah,
and we just keep putting it in the backpack.
yeah,
And this is by the time we were 18, definitely 25, we've probably experienced a lot of grief experiences in our life.
yeah,
You know, if you have a friend that dies, if you have a family, like your best friend moves, it doesn't even have to be you that moves. Your best friend could move. Like there's, if we think about all the things that are out of our control,
yeah,
especially as children, and we can't express how we feel about that,
yeah, for sure.
no wonder we're adults walking around feeling like we're not heard and not speaking up for ourselves, right?
Yeah,
So
definitely.
that speaks to the cumulative part. So eventually we implode or we explode from carrying this backpack of rocks.
Yeah. Yeah, that was it for me, and I think this is kind of help with our conversation here as we move forward. But when I started to unravel the grief layer, what I realized, my mother died back in 2018, and she had a long life. But I remember when she died, there was a part to me that was numb. I didn't really have an emotion, and I couldn't cry. I couldn't let out whatever it was that was going on. And it took a couple of years for me to really start to go, oh my God, my mom's experience, especially my early years, had significant impact on me because she was a woman who was depressed. She had a lot of anxiety. She, kind of had a lot of worry. There was loneliness. There were things that she was dealing with that as a child I didn't necessarily know how to process. I didn't even understand consciously what was going on. So what this kind of, for me, this kind of gets into what you do, is this whole idea of this method called the grief recovery process, because that was kind of like where we went in this kind of journey together, if you will. But it would be really great if you could just kind of give a bit of an idea or a bit of background on what is the grief recovery method, and how do you work with clients? What's that all about?
So the Grief Recovery Institute was actually developed, and I'm not sure which came first, the institute or the book. I'd actually have to look that up. But anyway, the co-author, the author, main author of the Grief Recovery Handbook, which is the book that we use to facilitate our programs, because there's also a pet loss program. There's also a helping children with loss program that's based on the book When Children Grieve.
Okay.
But the Grief Recovery Method handbook was written by John James, who co-founded the Grief Recovery Institute. And he was a Vietnam veteran. He has since passed just recently in the last year, I believe. But he and his wife had lost a child, an infant. And then consequently, their marriage fell apart as a
Yeah.
result. And he went to the beach and he was going to end his life.
Yeah.
And he had the thought come to his mind, what do I wish would have been there for me? And it was that thought that prompted him to not take his own life
Yeah.
and to really dig into his own grief and understanding it and how it led him to that beach, to
Hmm.
wanting to end his own life.
Yeah.
And so he started working. He was working as a contractor at the time, and he just started to talk to people. And that's how the grief recovery method came to be, and the Grief Recovery Institute. And it's been around for over 40 years, but
Yeah.
it's only in the last, I'd say 5 years or so, where it's really become online and it's more, times have changed, right? So it's becoming more on the internet. That wasn't
Yeah.
his thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's steadily organically grown over the years, but it's the one thing that changed my life,
Yeah.
and I presume yours.
Yeah, absolutely. In
The
many ways,
grief,
for sure.
yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I think about the method that you use, right, it was really drilling down. I think it starts, if I understand correctly, as this whole idea around, it tends to be the relationship with your primary caregivers, right? Like, it's mapping out, what those relationships were about and the impact, right? So there's a very, very structured process that you use to kind of take people through that. And that's the question maybe that I have, like, so when you work with a client, what's your approach? How does that work with a client unfold for you?
Yeah, so the method itself, it kind of builds on itself every week. And so it
Okay.
really is imperative that the person is fully committed to the process. It's not like something you can drop in and out of. We have group programs, but it's not something where you can just pop in and out. It's when you commit, you're committing to you, to your future, because it really is about resolving the past so you can move forward. It's
Yeah.
resolving the pain. It's not
Yes.
about forgetting. It's not about condoning. It's about none of that. It involves forgiveness, but in forgiveness, it's not too also about condoning. I'm a victim of sexual abuse.
Yeah.
That was a really difficult piece for me, but
Mhm.
forgiveness was imperative to my healing.
Yeah.
And it wasn't for him, it was for me.
Yeah.
And so we walk you through the hardest losses and hardest experiences of your life through this action-based, evidence-proven, the
Yeah.
only evidence-proven program to address grief. One-on-one, the program itself is 7 weeks.
Okay.
But my program, I've incorporated it along with YouMap. And so my is actually 12 weeks. And we go through 2 relationships. And like you mentioned, generally we do start with your most influential belief passing people
Yeah.
in your life, which tends to be your parents.
Yeah.
And so that's generally where we start. And yeah, and so working with me, it's either online or in person, and it's the 12 weeks. And yeah, it really truly was the one thing that transformed my grief and everything. All of those accomplishments you listed in the beginning of this podcast happened, except for the book, because I did write the book prior to grief recovery, which was really part of my process. Actually, it probably was the catalyst of me realizing that I wasn't okay, because I had another loss in the process of, like, shortly after that book was published, I had another loss and then another loss the following year. And so when I thought I was okay in the process of writing the book, I realized I wasn't when those losses occurred after writing the book. And
Yeah.
so, like I said, everything that's happened and I've accomplished since writing the book and since grief recovery has been because I addressed my grief.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an interesting part that you mentioned here, and I don't want to discount this, because in my experience, in as I was going through, I went through a time period where it was almost like everything kind of just went to heck, and I burned out. I crashed. I went to like the deepest kind of level emotionally. And one of the things that I discovered was it was really, really hard to talk to anybody else about my grief. Like if, it seems that it's almost like a conversation that many people don't want to have. So, and that was my experience, is I would kind of go and, talk to somebody and they say, oh, well, why don't you just look at things a little brighter, and, it'll get better, and it's like, maybe you can do some affirmations or something like that. And there was a part where many of these conversations, it was a different dialogue that I needed to have. And so in this process, when you and I worked together, and also just through my own circle of people that I had, is that I had people that were able to hear me, to, something like that. I'm trying to kind of maybe distinguish between this thing where as a society we seem to struggle having that conversation, and but then there's something very important about grief work that is about having that conversation, getting it off your chest. So I'm just curious. I don't know if I've made sense there of how I've described it, but I'd love to get your input on that, because it seems to me that my biggest challenge was coming into a society where I really had something that I needed to say, but for the most part, it was really hard for me to find people that were able to hear, you know?
Mm.
So,
Well, and what I say to that, and I've said it many times in various podcast episodes, is that, you know, we have a term in grief recovery. It's called a heart with ears. And that's what we call ourselves as grief recovery specialists, really, is we're a heart with ears. And it comes back to this idea of there's nothing to fix. You're not broken. It's grief is normal and it's natural. And we've like created it to be this taboo, evil thing. Does it feel good? No, absolutely not. It unravels everything in our lives. It blows up our lives.
yeah,
But it's a process of picking up the pieces and making them something new. I can't remember, there's like this, the Japanese have this proverb, or there's this saying or something, where the cracks, there's like a vase and it's broken, and then you put it back together, and where the cracks all were, there's gold.
yeah,
It's almost just like putting your life back together with just these golds
yeah,
lines all the way around it. I don't know, I can't remember how it goes, but anyway, I think you get the illustration.
yeah,
So yeah, it really is difficult to find people because everyone's struggling with something.
yeah,
And if someone's in it themselves, their ears are not open to what's going on with you
yeah,
or me or their neighbor or
mm,
anybody. This is why working on ourselves is so healing to the world.
yeah,
It has ripples in the world, because the more people that address their grief and address and work on themselves,
yeah,
there's ripples in that, just like there's ripples in grief.
yeah,
Because we bring that better version, that healthier version. I don't even want to say better, just a healthier version, a more balanced version, a more harmonized version of ourselves to our relationships, our jobs. We're more productive. We're beams of light
yeah,
rather than clouds of darkness, right? And somber or melancholy, you know, and there's nothing wrong with that either. But I don't believe that there's any human being that wishes to stay in that place.
yeah,
And so it's really difficult for people to be a heart with ears for others when they have not allowed themselves to find that for themselves.
right,
And a big part of seeking help, because we can't heal on an island. It's why the art for my podcast is me on an island with a megaphone, because you feel like you're on an island. You feel like you're screaming and no one's hearing you.
yeah,
It's very alienating.
yeah,
But do we do that to ourselves? In a lot of ways. But that's also how society has addressed grief.
yeah,
You do your thing, I'll do mine. You worry about your stuff, I'll worry about mine.
yeah,
There's this disconnection. And there is a lot of research being done actually on suicide and how connection is the antidote for suicide.
yeah. And we've got this whole crisis, with COVID and the world right now, right, where there's this crisis of loneliness. There's this disconnection that people have, and and maybe that's kind of the question, is that, are we, I almost kind of feel like we're in a denial of grief in our society, but we're also in a crisis where there's this unresolved piece that I kind of feel that many of us carry. And sometimes we know it, sometimes we don't, you know?
Well, it's overwhelming.
Yeah,
It's like, even if you, so, and this was me too, like I felt like, it's like, I know how I'm feeling. I feel crazy, number one.
yes,
Secondly, I feel like this is never going to end. Like I'm just destined to suffer my entire life.
yeah,
It's overwhelming. Where do I even begin?
yeah,
And the thing is it, you know, had I known about grief recovery in 2014,
yeah,
oh my goodness sakes.
yeah,
I mean, it wasn't 4 years later. It was another 4 years.
yeah,
I feel like, man, I wish I'd have known about it sooner.
yeah,
I wish I'd have known about it before I had kids. Man,
yeah,
if every person had went through the grief recovery method before they became parents,
yeah.
your children would be better off for it. And so would
And
you.
yeah, and even as children, right, if we were to be able to understand grief at an early age, or that ability to express what was going on for us and not be reprimanded or not be punished, or or whatever, whatever we tend to do in society. So as we kind of go through that, like so if somebody goes through the process with you and they do that work one on one, you go through that process, and I understand it here very clearly that you say that somebody has to have a real resolve to want to work through this stuff. This is not like just a drop in thing that you kind of do. It's so people are coming with to you and saying, hey, you know what, I really want to do this work, and I respect that, because I know that that's what I had to do. But what would you say are some of the outcomes after you've gone through this process? What happens for an individual?
You unleash your heart.
Okay.
That's my feeling. I
Yeah.
feel like you unleash the burdens in your heart. You unleash whatever you've been carrying, anger, guilt, shame, like my shoulders, like my spirit, like my soul, like everything about me was different.
Yeah.
Like the person that went on that plane to go to Austin, to go through this method myself, do the work,
Yeah.
was not the same person that came back. And like I said, it unlocked my potential
Yeah.
because I have said yes to so many things that have, one thing leads to the next thing, leads to the next thing. I'm a Reiki master, and now I'm soon going to be a biofield tuning practitioner. That's more energy work. It's a different modality, but I'm loving it. I'm
Yeah.
absolutely loving it. And I can bring that to my family and my friends and my community. That has ripples. Unlocking my potential has ripples in my family, my kids' lives, my neighborhood, my community, my friends, right? Like we start saying yes to things that juice us up and light us up.
Yeah. That's really important. I know for me, I went through the experience. I think that, and again, this is self-reflective. Sometimes it's not very, you know, I realized that I had a narcissism about me because I was in so much grief. Everything was fixated on me,
Mhm.
that I couldn't show up for others.
Yep. I just want to interject another reason why you can't listen to other people in their grief, right?
Right.
I just wanted
Yeah.
to mention that. Good
Yeah.
point.
And that was it. Like it's and I will say that it's a process that just kind of like evolves over time,
Mhm.
but there's been a gradual unraveling where, oh, I'm not going through this feeling of shame. I'm not going through this feeling of real hurt. I'm not going through this feeling of, feeling rejected, whatever those things are. But now I'm going through this feeling of, what can I contribute? What can I do? What can I create? And it really is a way to kind of like open up in the world more.
It cracks you open. It brings more compassion.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's
And
yeah, go for it.
and it helps you develop a new relationship.
Yeah.
Whatever relationship you worked on, you move forward with a different relationship. a different kind of relationship on your terms.
Yeah.
Because what happens when you go through grief recovery as well, you also learn where you didn't have boundaries
Yes.
that you knew you should have had, or you find where you need them.
Yeah.
And you put them in place. And so you can move forward with a new kind of relationship on your terms, whether that person is dead or alive, because even when the person's deceased, that relationship continues because you still have feelings, you still have emotions, you still have thoughts that go back to the past. And so instead of turning to anger and resentment and bitterness, which are all the things that we address in grief recovery,
Yeah.
you can move forward with a new relationship because you can look at that with compassion and understanding and an entirely new perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I noticed for me, through my relationship with my mother and my father, I developed this people pleasing personality, right? It was that part to me that obsessively felt that I had to respond to another person, right? So they could be angry, they could be upset, but there was a part to me that had this kind of either fixing or or feeling mode, and that was very much related to this grief work. And I did realize there was part to that oh, that personality construct of reaction was just something that, and again, I say that it's a combination of things. It's the grief work, but it's just me building more of that introspection awareness around my own beliefs and around my patterns, my behaviors and things like that. But it's helped me to start changing some of that perspective just within my life of how I operate in my life. So here's one question I want to ask just before we leave grief for a second in this specific conversation. But do men and women experience grief differently?
I think every single person experiences grief differently because every single person has a different relationship and a unique relationship with the person in which they feel they have grief with, or as a result of them dying or that relationship, right? So every grief experience is unique because the relationship is unique. Now,
Yeah,
how it shows up, that will play a lot of things contribute to that. Our environment that we grew up in, how grief was talked about growing up. If you were taught how to like coping skills, if your life experience and your environment, that's where it's like, well, which path are you going to take? Is it going to be one of self-destruction, like outward self-destruction? Or is
yeah,
it going to be one of like this internal physical breakdown, progressive breakdown of
yeah,
your body and of your, just your whole spirit,
yeah,
which both is a breakdown of spirit, right? It's really disempowering to be in either of those places, like expressing it in either way.
yeah,
But generally speaking, overall, we all tend to exhibit behaviors that are unhealthy when we're grieving, whether we're projecting anger or narcissism type
yeah,
tendency, or blaming, or being the victim,
yeah,
or it's all of that stuff, or resorting to those behaviors which we call STIRBs, short-term energy relieving behaviors that help you to feel better for a short period of time, like you expressed earlier. Food or alcohol, can
yeah,
be gambling, can be porn, sex, relationships. If you're one relationship to the next, to the next, to the next,
yeah,
if you're always looking for this outward thing to fill what's missing within you, you're going to be looking for a long time because it's never going to happen.
yeah.
You
Oh,
got to create that and nurture that and discover that within yourself.
yeah,
And you have to bring a lot of self-compassion that there's so many of us that walk around, and I was one of them, just self-loathing.
yeah,
Like if people could see the word bubbles above our heads of what we were telling ourselves,
yeah,
oh my gosh, we would how illuminating that would be, right?
Yeah. I want to capture this point is that grief also drives our addictions, right? So and this whole thing around addictions, right? Because people focus, oh, you got an addiction to this, whatever that is. But many times it's the grief that's driving it.
We have
Yeah.
a thought, then we have a feeling about that thought,
Yes.
and that feeling drives our actions.
Got it. Yeah. And then we find ways to compensate through that whole process, right? Like that's what we do. We compensate through some sort of addiction based either emotion or physical behavior that takes us away from having to feel the grief. Is that a way to say it?
Well, again, it depends on your environment and how you grew
Yeah.
up. If you were in an environment where there's like emotional detachment, like you didn't have that emotional connection with your caregiver or caretaker, and it was, you know, there was this, you didn't want to disrupt, you didn't want to rock the boat,
Yeah.
you didn't want to make someone else. So this is the thing too, like parents may often say, "You're making me so angry."
Yeah.
And let's dissect that a little bit because, okay, let's say your child is 10 years old and you say that to your child who's 10 years old, "You're making me so angry." Well, that 10-year-old's not going to look at it like, well, they're not consciously thinking, well, I'm really powerful. I can make her angry. Well, if
Right.
I can make her angry, I can do this thing and I can have that, do that thing, and I can get this reaction, right?
Yeah.
So that's a lot of power we hand other people. And so
Yeah.
if you were a child that understood that, that's an exchange, emotional exchange, like I have the power to make someone else angry. You're going to recognize that as a child, and that's going to be a manipulation tactic that you'll probably resort to as an adult in your relationships. And
Very much.
so
Yeah.
if the parent can emulate emotional stability, and even if they feel themselves getting angered by what the child is doing, it's one thing to say, "You are making me angry." And it's an entirely a different thing to say, "That behavior is upsetting me," or "That behavior is angering me." But here's the thing, no one can make you angry.
Yeah.
You allow yourself. All that's really showing is you've got something to work on within yourself. Why is this thing provoking you?
Yeah.
This was the hardest thing for me to comprehend and wrap my head around, and really was one of the hardest things for me to work on as a parent, because I was a ragey mom.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was me,
Yeah. Yeah.
because I was an angry child.
Yeah.
And although I didn't outwardly express my anger until I was probably a teenager, like with words,
Yes.
but I was very much the emotional dumping ground in my household for others.
Yeah.
And so when you are that in your environment, there isn't room for your stuff. There isn't room for you to grieve. There isn't room for you to express your emotions.
Yeah.
It's just not allowed. It's not acceptable. It's not, there isn't room for it. And so then I that's where I was a stuffer.
Yeah.
And so not everybody stuffs, right?
Yeah.
But we learn these things from our environment. It's even if it's subconscious
Yeah.
or it's unintended,
Yeah.
actions and behaviors have an impact and a consequence.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that I've learned through this, and again, this is coming from the technology world, and sometimes where we try to, as a society, create a quick fix, right? It's like, hey, what's the app for that? Or, how do we create this business model that's going to improve our lives in some way? And what I've realized through this process is that, there's not an app for this. There's not a quick fix. There's something about the value of that human connection where there's a listener and a griever. It's almost like, that's a really important piece. So that's very important. I want to talk about YouMap because you bring another approach that when I first kind of like heard it, I thought, okay, well, how does this relate to grief? But because I've done things like career assessments and looking at what my talents are and things like that. But you brought this methodology into our conversations called YouMap. So I'd love for you to kind of help me to understand what is YouMap and why do you bring that to your work with clients?
So what I was finding is after my clients would be addressing their grief, it was kind of like this, well, what now? Because for a lot of people who've come to the grief recovery method, they're generally older,
Yeah.
midlife, around midlife, maybe 30 to 50 in that time frame. But they might be looking at a career change, or because of a loss, they're questioning their entire life. Like, well, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? That's often kind of what happens when someone dies close to us. We're like, well, gee, they died. I guess I can die too. And what, it's like every time there's someone dies, you kind of think about your own mortality, right? But when it's a really big loss, someone really close to you, you really do question. And sometimes you're forced to, because if your spouse died and they were the breadwinner, well, now what?
Yes.
And so, and I just found that for myself personally, like, okay, well, I've addressed this stuff. I feel like a completely new, brand new version of myself. I see so much potential. I see opportunity. But now what?
Right.
How do I discern what's for me? That's really what it's about, is discernment. Because when you're grieving, discernment is really difficult and challenging because your focus is difficult. It's hard to concentrate. It seems like everything takes a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And so once we've addressed that, UMAP is the now what. And we find your top 5 strengths,
Okay.
which change over time because our experiences change. And
Yeah.
so with the death of a loved one, you might be, if we think of the strengths as there's 34 different strengths in the Gallup Strength Finder, and if we think of them as coffee mugs in the cupboard, we tend to, even if we had 34 coffee mugs in the cupboard, we'll probably use probably 2 or 3 the most, right? Maybe even
Yeah.
5, but there's always the ones you use the most. Well, someone dies, let's say your breadwinner spouse dies. Well, now all of a sudden you're having to pull out different mugs. You might be pulling out resourcefulness. So where you weren't resourceful before, well, now you're going to have to start becoming resourceful. So that's a strength that you build.
Yeah.
And that's a muscle that you work on because of your circumstances and experience. So that's why strengths can change over time. We also discover your values. And it's not just like a simple, yeah, I value this and I value that. And yeah, I like growth, but it really is to be intentional with what drives your actions.
Yes.
Because usually and often it is not just our feelings about something, but what our values.
Yeah.
It's how we feel about something.
Yeah.
So I feel really strongly about growth. Growth is very important to me. That is one of my values. So if I'm in a relationship or let's say I'm in a working environment where growth isn't a part of their strategy, where it's not something that's nurtured, that's going against my value. That's dishonoring my value of growth.
Yes.
So by staying in that environment, I'm dishonoring my own value of growth.
Mm-hmm.
And so other people can dishonor our values, but we can also dishonor our own values. So like trust and honesty, those are, honesty is one of mine. Don't lie to me.
Yeah.
Because that is, that's a sin in my book. So we discover your values, which often drives our behaviors, right? Because that's how we feel about something. And then we also discover your preferred skills and how you're wired. And so all of those things together is what's called a YouMap. And it really can be your guiding. It's almost like your lighthouse.
Yeah.
It's your guide moving forward.
Yeah.
Any opportunity that comes your way, you can put it up against your strengths, your values, your skills, and how you're wired. And
Yeah.
just black and white. It's right there. You can see, well,
Yeah.
this is a good fit or this isn't.
Yeah. I relate it to just the term that, people talk about, where this idea that, how do we find our authentic self? And sometimes when we have a big layer of grief or some emotional or obstacle or mental obstacle in the way, it's very hard to find our authenticity. It's, because we're in pain.
Mhm.
But it's when you start to, you know, release some of that, you start to look at, finding more authenticity around, hey, who am I in the world? How do I want to be? And what is that? And like you say, it sounds to me that it's something that changes over our lifetime. It evolves, if you will.
Our strengths change.
Our strengths change. Fair
Yep.
enough.
Our
Yeah.
values generally do not.
Got it. Got it.
Yep. And our preferred skills probably change somewhat depending
Yeah.
on experience. If you learn something new that you really love and enjoy doing, right? Those can change.
Yeah.
But how you're wired and how, which is like how you perceive the world,
Yeah.
and strengths can change.
Yeah.
Or yeah. Well, how you perceive the world generally, I mean, that can change too, right? So
Yeah.
based on experience. But yeah, it really does open you up to your own potential, and you see yourself more clearly.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
when you know yourself, this is the founder of YouMap, Kristen Sherry, said, and I have the quote on my website because I think it's just a stellar quote. The more you know yourself, the less you look to others to tell you who you are.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And the less you are influenced by the responses of the outer world in how you run your life, the more
Right.
the more you show up within you as a whole person, right? I think that's really cool.
And that brings up a good point too, and that another byproduct of working through your grief and your stuff, your baggage, is that you become more in tune with your intuition.
Yeah.
You're able to sit and hear yourself rather than all the noise and the monkey mind that is overcome with grief.
Yes. So what I'm hearing through our conversation, through my experience working with you, is that if we're suffering from grief, we can overcome our grief. Is that a right way to say it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Grief recovery is hope.
Yeah. So it's an opportunity for us to say, you know what, there's something that I can do about this, and I can make, I can make this change. We can move through something.
And I feel like I need to say something because it's just coming up in my mind. So I think I
Yeah.
need to speak it. There might be people listening to this, and I
Yeah.
don't know that I've ever said it this way, or I don't even know if I've ever said this, but there might be people listening and thinking, well, that worked for you. It's not going to work for me.
Yeah.
Or I've tried something like that and it didn't work for me. Or, well, what works for one doesn't always work for all.
Yes.
And I'll just say right now, can I swear?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just say that's BS.
Got it.
BS.
Yeah.
This program is for anyone and everyone who has experienced the normal and natural experience that is grief,
Yes.
regardless of your loss.
Yeah.
This method is for everyone.
Yeah.
Whether you're 30 plus years out from your grief, your loss, your trauma, like me,
Yeah.
or you're 4 years out, 3
Yeah.
years out.
Yeah.
It's never too late and it's never too soon. And I would ask you, what do you have to lose? Because I would also ask you, what have you lost already?
Yes. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. I think that hits it home, right? I think that's such an important part to it. So I want to finish off here because I know we're coming up to time, and like I said, like there's a number of things that I could, we could talk about the work that you do as an end of life doula. Like I think that's a whole topic within itself, right? And I'm really sad that we don't have time to focus on that today. But there's two questions that I have. If we, as a society, what do you feel is one change we could make, which would help as a society? I have to ask, I'm going to read this. What do you feel is one change we could make to the way we deal with grief as a society?
Be open to understanding that there's a lot to learn about it. When we learn new knowledge,
Yeah,
that's great. But then to take that knowledge and apply it in your
yeah,
relationships and in your life, that's when things change. That's when, as a society, we change.
yeah,
And that is really the premise of my podcast, is to bring grieving voices, people to share their stories, where people can hear other people's stories and hear themselves in those other people's stories, and hear the tips and the things that they share, the unhelpful comments that people have said to them. So they learn, well, now I know not to say that, right? Because it's learning, being open to learning
yeah,
that you don't know it all, even if you're in it.
yeah,
Trust me, the reason why grief is so difficult is because you don't understand it.
yeah,
You don't understand that that's really truly what's messing up your life on all areas.
yeah,
It's not just making you sad or
yeah,
depressed.
yeah,
It's affecting everything in your life, but we don't connect the dots to all those pieces.
yeah, yeah,
Learn
absolutely.
the new knowledge and then apply it. And
Yeah,
get the grief recovery handbook, because that'll teach you a lot. Or listen to the first 10 episodes of my podcast, because I share a lot in those first 10 episodes. It's all information in those
yeah,
first 10 for sure.
yeah, awesome. Two things. So if someone is experiencing grief, loss, depression, and you've already talked about some of the things that they can do, but where do you feel that if they need that deeper conversation, where can they get help?
The Grief Recovery Institute is the
Yeah,
griefrecoverymethod.com. If you're looking for a grief recovery specialist because there's a lot of therapists actually that go through the grief
yeah,
recovery method, because their 8 years of schooling do not address grief.
yeah,
This is the thing, like you're, a licensed social worker, licensed master social worker, psychiatrist, psychologist, their schooling does not address grief. Blows my mind. So there's a lot of therapists who have gone through the method, who use it in their practices, that can take insurance. So if that's important to you, go to the griefrecoverymethod.com to find a therapist in your state, because usually, or your country, because we are in many countries too, by the way,
yeah, yeah,
including Canada. So find someone, that can legally help you and support you in your grief that way. Go to my website, theunleashedheart.com.
got it.
And you can work with me one-on-one. And I'm currently working on getting the group program online to start doing groups.
Got it.
So that's in the works. And read the Grief Recovery Handbook. It's also an Audible.
Yeah,
My podcast, Grieving Voices, you can feel hope.
yeah,
Really, there's a lot of hope in my podcast. So I encourage you to listen to that. And locally, look for support. Like, find your heart with ears. It's likely not anyone who has skin in your game. So it's not going to be a family, and
yeah,
it might not even be a friend,
yeah,
someone close to you, but someone who doesn't have any skin in your game. What do
yeah,
I mean by that? They don't have anything to lose by just listening to you.
yeah, yeah. Awesome. And I'll provide all the links that you've suggested in the show notes, so people will have access that they can click on that. I really appreciate you spending time with me today. And I guess just before we end, is there anything else you might want to say or want to share new projects you're working on, anything like that?
Yeah. So speaking to the end of life doula thing, I've had this desire to support people who have been diagnosed with a terminal illness. That
Okay.
was my personal experience with my father. He died of colon cancer.
Yeah.
He was 44 and I was 8. And I know that he died in a nursing home. And I just know that, he didn't have, I feel in my heart that he did not have a dying experience that he could have had. And that's what end of life doula training has taught me, is that we can have a good death, and
Yes.
that when we are diagnosed with a terminal illness, if or when, or if our loved one is, there is an opportunity there to experience a good death with your loved one. It is possible. And so I really want to bring something forth to support those who are dealing with that. And so that's kind of noodling and working through that as we speak. But yeah, and the group program to bring that online, because I can offer that online. And yeah, just continue with my podcast. I'm going to have my 100th episode here in next week
Yeah.
in May
That's
here.
awesome.
So
Yeah, that's awesome. So that website again is theunleashedheart.com. The podcast is Grieving Voices. So you can find that, I believe. I know you can find it on your website, but it's also through some of the podcast search engines too, right? You can find it.
everywhere podcasts are available. You can say,
Yeah.
Alexa, play Grieving Voices.
Yeah. And I've listened to some of the episodes within that, and they're excellent. They're really well done. So it's good stuff. So I'm really glad that you're bringing the voice to grief, or you're somebody who is kind of bringing that conversation around it. And that was the reason why I wanted to have you on this conversation, or on this episode, because it's been just a very important part to my journey. And so just really important. And like I said, I think it would be really interesting to continue this conversation at another stage, and we can go deeper into some of these areas, which I think would be really exciting. So anyway, thank you for joining me today, Victoria. I really appreciate it. And thank you, the listeners, for hanging out with us for a little bit. So you guys, everybody, have a great day.